So what I will do is make sure you've got a handout. I will start the video like any good sub. I start the movie, right? Okay. So I'm going to start the movie, and we'll take a look at this first segment, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. I'll have you discuss it, and we'll talk a little bit about it going forward. Here we go.
Good morning. If all has gone according to plan, I will currently be in a plane over the Atlantic Ocean, returning back stateside. My wife and I were over at a wedding for a cousin of mine in Turkey this past week. I lived with her for a couple of years, more like a sister. I was walking her down the aisle at her wedding. And so we are on our way back. Chris Strand has graciously agreed to facilitate and accommodate the class this morning. It's going to be a little bit of a different format, obviously. So there's going to be several short segments of video with discussion questions that are for you individually and as a group, however Chris facilitates that. And then some time together as a class working through the key topics for today. So we want to keep making progress in the book. We're going to do just like we have for all of our other weeks. We'll start with a little bit of a period of review, and then we're going to make continued progress through the second and third dialogue cycles today as we continue to work through this really complicated book of Job. And so to review, we're just going to briefly remind you of the overall structure. These are things we've spent a lot of times looking at. And this just kind of helps us refresh and remember that the key movements of the book. So, of course, it started in the first two chapters with Job's trials. And we saw how this focus shifted from Job's life on earth to the events in heaven, to then the first trial, and then a return to the scene in heaven between God and Satan. And then Job's second trial. And then the focus stayed on Job as his wife talked with him, and then his three friends came. And so in those opening chapters, we talked a lot about God and his interaction with Satan and the wager and what that involved. If you're unclear or kind of fuzzy about some of those details, I encourage you to go back and watch some of those earlier lessons that are available online. The next key section in the book is Job 3, where Job curses the day of his birth. He regrets the fact that he was ever born because his suffering is so great. And this is what really starts the rest of the book in motion, as Job laments his birth, then the friends begin responding, because in chapters 4 through 14, we see speech cycle 1. And this is what we've been dealing with over the last couple of weeks as we were looking at who those three friends are, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and how they respond to Job and how Job responds to them. And so we really want to make sure that cycle number 1 is under our belt. And so that's what these first series of questions is going to be focused on, is really solidifying what that first cycle is all about. And so these are questions that have been addressed previously, but are helpful for us to communicate and articulate ourselves, and maybe to even take notes on during the classroom discussion. So the first question is, what are the friends' basic theory of how the world works? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are unique in some of the ways that they talk to Job, but they all have an underlying theory of how the world works, how God works in relationship to people and suffering and evil. So spend a few minutes thinking through and talking through that question. The next question is, how then do the friends apply this theory of how the world works to Job? So what is the theory, and then how then do they apply it to Job's situation? So another way of talking about this, we talked about last week, the you pick two idea, and how does the you pick two idea work for the friends? When I talk about the you pick two, what does that mean? How does it work for the friends? As a reminder, This is the you pick two triangle. We have the three elements of God's justice, Job's suffering, and Job's righteousness. And so I'm wanting you to kind of remember and recall, what is this triangle? How does it work? How does it work for the friends? And how do they relate this to Job? So that's going to be the first block of questions for you to take time and to think through as Chris facilitates this conversation.
Okay, on your handout there, you can see the questions. Just kind of break into some small groups there at your tables and take a few minutes here, and we'll go through and just ask the question, what's the basic theory that the friends have about the world? What's their kind of their worldview with respect to this, and how do they apply that to Job? And we'll talk a little bit too about our you pick two triangle as well to see how that fits in. So take a few minutes here and just kind of work your way through it, and then I'm going to pull you back in and we'll talk about it a little bit. All right. How did you make out on the questions? So what is, with these three friends, what is their basic underlying theory about how the world works, how God works with respect to righteousness and people and things like that? What is their theory here? Sin is punished. Matt, what was it you said? Karma. What goes around comes around, that kind of thing. Now, I got to put in a disclaimer. We don't do karma in the Free Church. But it's kind of that same concept if you think about it. What goes around comes around. So that's the theory that these guys are working under. We're human beings commit sin, and therefore, as human beings, we are subject to a certain level of suffering in our lives because of the fact that we are sinners. So how do they apply this theory to Job? First of all, with Eliphaz, the first guy. Eliphaz is kind of the kind and considerate guy, at least starting out. He starts out fairly gently with Job, but what is he saying? Were you able to pick anything out? Basically, if you're reading through that first part, Eliphaz is saying, if you sin, you're going to suffer. And he's saying basically, essentially, that Job, you're wrong to protest your suffering. You're wrong to do that. You need to take your lumps because of what you've done. All people are sinners, and so therefore they deserve some degree of suffering. So take your suffering, learn from it, and then move on. How about Bildad? The Shuhite, shortest guy in the Bible. Bildad is more argumentative. He's saying, you must be sinning. That's why these things are happening to you. God is just, and therefore, because you are sinning, these things are taking place. You're wrong to be protesting about your suffering, because you really do deserve it. Everything that God does is right, and you're wrong to protest. And then thirdly, Zophar. What's his point? Zophar is even more harsh and rude as you go along. He says, you are sinning. He's essentially saying, Job, you are sinning, with that increasingly harsh tone. You're not getting everything that you deserve from God. So each one takes a different approach. The message is essentially the same. You're sinning, therefore you suffer. But the approach is a little bit different in each one, and the degree of kindness, if you want to call it that, is different in each one. So their theory is correct. They are right about God, correct, in that God is just, and God is going to punish sin. But what about their view of Job? How have we seen him described earlier in the book? He's righteous. So they may be correct about God, but they're not correct about Job. They've concluded that Job is suffering because of sin. And Job goes on to say, no, I'm not. I'm rejecting that assumption that you're placing on me. So they are right about God, but they are wrong about Job. Now, how does the you pick two work for the friends? Do you remember the diagram from last week? We've got these three elements. So the friends are saying what? Exactly. Those two are connected. Leave this one out of it. Job, you're not righteous. So that's why you are suffering, because God is just, and you're not righteous. So that's the view that they're taking of our little you pick two triangle type of thing. That's the way they're relating it to Job. Job, you're not righteous. You're not as righteous as you think you are. That's why you're suffering, because you're dealing with a just God. Good so far? All right, let's look at the next segment.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the second block conversation of how does Job then respond? So we're just kind of getting that first cycle under our belt. We know about the friends. So now how does Job respond to those friends? And they're going to be very similar questions. We want to make sure we understand the key messages and content of this cycle. So first, I want you to discuss what Job is claiming in the selected verses. So on the handout, you will see verses as Job's response to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. You'll see some of the key verses that we've looked at. And in bold are especially key verses that really help summarize Job's primary message. So we don't just want to wrestle with the ideas, we also want to look at the verses. So looking at those verses, try and paraphrase, what do those verses mean, and how does Job then reply to the friends and what it is that they're saying about Job and Job's wickedness that brings the suffering on himself. And so then related, so what then, given the fact that Job says these things, given the fact that you've talked through the message of what these things are that Job says, what's Job's theory about how the world works? And what then does Job think about God? And really, these questions are kind of getting at this fundamental idea. How does the you pick two work for Job? So you talked about how the you pick two works for the friends. How does it work for Job? The friends condemn Job as being unrighteous. What then does Job do? And how do you know it? What is it in the verses that help you understand how Job puts his world together and what it is that he says about his own suffering, his own righteousness, and God's justice? And so again, Crystal's going to facilitate this conversation and how the verses are going to be divided up. But these questions help us really understand what it is that Job is saying and responding to the friends for our second time of discussion.
All right, you can see in that section on Job's response, there are some verses in there. Get into your groups again and take advantage of those verses, read through those to just get an idea of how to answer these questions. How is Job responding to his friends, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar? And what's his basic theory? What's Job's basic theory? We've seen the friends' basic theory of how the world works, but what's Job's basic theory of how the world works? And what does Job think about God? And then where does Job put himself on our you pick two chart? How does he review that? So take a couple minutes, go through those verses, just pull out some highlights. Be prepared to defend your answers, maybe. All right. So as you've read through these verses, what is Job really trying to tell us here? How does he respond, first of all, to Eliphaz? Chapter 6. He's kept the wager. What do you mean? Oh, okay. He hasn't cursed God, particularly in verse 10, right? Chapter 6, verse 10. Job makes the point that I have not denied the Holy One. That is my one consolation. That's what he talks about in that passage, in that verse. So in response to what Eliphaz is claiming about Job, Job says, hey, even though he doesn't know this wager took place, right? That all took place in heaven, so Job is unaware of what went on. But at the same time, Job has not denied the Holy One, and he's made that point to Eliphaz. Anything else? Any other responses to Eliphaz that he gives? What about verse 4 of chapter 6? God is just, but what? Okay. What is he saying there? Let me look at it quick here. Chapter 6, verse 4. Where it says, your words have helped the I'm in the wrong chapter. Hang on. He says, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. Their poison my spirit drinks. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. What kind of an attitude does Job have here? Sure. Believes God is responsible. And believes what about God at this point? God is against me, right? If my situation were more normal, I wouldn't be complaining. But in this particular situation, God is against me. He's really coming down on me. I'm drinking the poison from these arrows, things like that. Look at chapter 7, verse 11. What's his response there, too? He has a right to complain. I have not denied the Holy One, as he talked about. And so therefore, I have a right to complain. I have a right to voice my complaints to God. So he's got that attitude coming into it as well. He's that line of thinking for Job. And then on verse 20 of chapter 7, what does he say? He uses an interesting turn of phrase there to describe God. Watcher of men. It's kind of interesting. I don't know how it reads in some of the other translations. I use the New American Standard, and if you've been in my classes before, you know that is the only inspired translation. Okay? So that's how he responds, thinking, God, why are you persecuting me? Tell me how I have sinned. But there's no answer at this point. Now, how does he respond to Bildad? Look at chapter 9, the second friend who's a little more harsh, a little more blunt in his assessment of Job. What about verses 2 to 3? Exactly. That point came up last week. How do I defend myself? I'm being prosecuted by the guy who's sitting at the judge's bench, too. How do I defend myself against that? There's an interesting word in there. Do your translations use the word dispute? In verse 3, I think it is. It's a legal term. That's a legal term which appears several times in Job, dealing with litigation. How do I litigate against God? There's no way. And then in verses 22 to 24 of chapter 9. What does he have to say there about God? There you go. You're being unfair. It really makes no difference whether I am blameless or wicked. The result is going to be the same. So it really makes no difference in the world. And that result is going to be my destruction. And then in chapter 10, verse 2, how does he look at that? What's his perspective on God that he's giving there? Chapter 10, verse 2, I will say to God, do not condemn me, let me know why you contend with me. I'm going to act in my own defense here, as Job, and make my complaint, even though it may result in my death. So, bring it on, God. List those charges that are against me. And then Zophar, the third friend, in chapter 12. How does he respond in verses 4 to 5? How does Job respond to Zophar's comments? The most harsh of the three friends. How does the world view Job, at least from his perspective at this time? He's a laughingstock. I'm despised. I'm a laughingstock. It's unfair that you guys, you three friends who are at ease in life, have this attitude towards suffering, that, hey, you deserve it. And then looking at verses 17 through 19 of chapter 12. This is an interesting take that Job has here. He says he makes counselors walk barefoot and makes fools of judges. He loosens the bond of kings and binds their loins with a girdle. He makes priests walk barefoot and overthrows the secure ones. Any idea what his point is here? This is a situation where Job is basically saying everybody is under God's control, and he's going to humble the mighty and the powerful people in the world, and he lists off several different examples of who they are. They are all going to be humbled as well. And by doing so, God is revealing that his wisdom is superior to that of man, and his wisdom is superior to that, or his power is superior to that of man as well. So Job is making that case too. Again, why is God attacking me like he is? And then looking at chapter 13, verse 15, makes another point there too. But it's an interesting point. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. Job is anticipating that he's probably going to die as a result of defending himself. That would be the thing that would take place. But he's determined to state his case before God and tell God that I'm not guilty. So what's his basic theory about how the world works? If we boil all these responses down, what's his theory? God is in control. It seems like he's unfair. What's God's plan for the wicked? Who should be punished? Let's ask that question. Who should be punished? Greg. He's picking on the wrong guy, right? The wicked should be punished, not the righteous. I'm not wicked. Well, me, I'm talking about Job. Okay, let's not make this. Job is not wicked. Job is righteous. God has defined him as righteous twice, and yet he's being punished. Greg, you got a point? He had an opinion. He didn't have the source documents, right? But he did have an opinion. He did. He did, yep. And what does he think about? What is he thinking about God right now? He's unfair. He's unfair and he's unjust. Where does Job land on our you pick two chart? He's got the bottom two. God is not just. I'm righteous, but I'm suffering because God is not just. So the friends are condemning Job for being unrighteous. What is Job doing as part of his responses? He's denying that. He's disputing it. And he's making his defense of being righteous before God. Comments on that? All right, let's jump to the third section on your questions there. Some more verses. We're going to get into the 3 cycles here, a little more discussion on that.
All right. And now for our third discussion, I want to start addressing the 3 cycles. So this is a lot of new information that's going to build on what we've been talking about, especially with the first dialogue cycle. And so just like with Job, I want you to look at a few key verses and ask, what is it that stays the same in each cycle? I want you to consider the structure of cycle 2 and the order of the speakers and how that relates to cycle 1. Do a little bit of comparison, looking at the order, looking at the numbers. How did cycle 1 work? And then how does speech cycle number 2 work? What stays the same, not only regarding the structure, but also regarding the content? How does the key claims of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar stay the same? How does Job's key claims stay the same from cycle 1 to cycle 2 to cycle 3? How does Job's use of the courtroom language stay the same? And then I also want us to consider the differences, right? We have 3 cycles, and they're not mere repetitions. They're repetitions with a difference. So also consider the changes within the cycles. Look at the content of cycle 3, especially Eliphaz. That's the one that's most helpful to see. review how Eliphaz spoke to Job in cycle 1, and then look at Eliphaz's last speech in chapter 22. And how does Eliphaz's tone and content change as representative of the friends, and how their tone and content changes over the course of the dialogue cycles. So we don't have time to go through each speech and look at some of the interesting differences and similarities in the way that they repeat language so that they show we're part of a dialogue. But we can get the key idea that there's a lot of things that stay the same, and there's some things that are changing in cycle 2 and cycle 3. And so during this segment, we're kind of focusing on some of those similarities and differences.
All right, so on your handout, in your groups, take a look at the structure of cycle 2 and look at those, respond to those questions. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And then what I'd like you to do, these two tables over here, you guys work on the questions related to the content of Eliphaz, okay? And then you two tables here in the middle, in your groups, but focus on Bildad, okay? And these two tables over here, in your groups again, but focus on Zophar. You can see how they're broken out into 3 groups there in the questions. And then finally, when you're done, when you think you got it, look at the content of Job, that question related to that content of Job as well. All right, so first off, with regard to the structure, what do you see? The structure of cycle 2. Any differences from cycle 1? The structure itself, just how it's put together. Follows the same pattern, right, as cycle 1. Eliphaz speaks, Job responds. Bildad speaks, Job responds. Zophar speaks, Job responds. You can see that as you go through chapter 15, verse 1 of 15, and 16, and 18, and 19, and 20, and 21. So that's the basic formula that's being followed here with respect to the structure. Kevin. Job does? I think you're... Exactly. You know, when you look at the content, as we progress through that, the 3 friends get more harsh in how they approach Job. You get into Eliphaz, for example, you know, basically in chapter 5, he tells Job, you're a windbag for all the things that you're saying. You're just a bag of wind. So what did you find here in that response from Eliphaz? When you compare what he told Job in chapter 5 versus what he said to Job in chapter 22. Anybody want to be bold and say something? We know that Eliphaz was the most compassionate of the group, at least initially. So back in chapter 5, he's telling Job, basically, seek out God and be happy in God's discipline because it's good for you. But then by chapter 22, what is he saying? Verses 21 to 23. Sure. Repent, right? Repent, turn to God in confession. It's much more forceful. Turn to God in confession, give up your sinful ways. So let me just look at that again here. In chapter 22, verses 21 to 23. I don't know how your translations read, but mine says yield. He's telling Job to yield, which is a much more strong word when looking at a relationship. It means to yield to God. So How about with respect to Bildad? Chapter 8 versus chapter 18. What did you guys discover? Yeah, nice guy, huh? So in chapter 8, Bildad is telling him, you're godless and you've forgotten God. Because of that, you're going to perish. And then in chapter 18, it's even worse. Your fate is sealed now. Your lamp is going to go out. This lamp is symbolizing life and prosperity. Your lamp is going to go out. You're going to die. You're going to be plunged into total darkness and complete confusion because of what's going on. And basically also in chapter 8, anyone who sins against God suffers the consequences. And what's the example that Bildad uses, Mr. Compassion here? The example of Job's children. Apparently your children sinned, so that's why they were killed. Not a nice thing to say in this particular situation. And the wicked man in verse 19 of chapter 18, he's going to be banished into darkness. There will be no descendants, and that person will be forgotten. What about Zophar? What did this group come up with down here? Comparing Job 11, verse 20 with Job 20, verse 23. Okay, so the wicked will fail. That's a good point. But God is also going to vent his anger. And to Kevin's point, go ahead, Kevin. Right. To Kevin's point, it almost seems like Zophar is the one who's really angry here, right? Rather than just God. His statements are really falsely accusing Job of being what? Look at chapter 20, verse 23. How wicked he is. And then even back up a couple verses. Look at verse 21. Nothing remains for him to devour, therefore his prosperity does not endure. In the fullness of his plenty he will be cramped. The hand of everyone who suffers will come against him. Job is a nasty guy. He's profiteering. He's taking advantage of the poor. That's what he's being accused of here by Zophar in this second cycle. So we see this. We have this Eliphaz lays his claim, Job responds. Bildad, same thing, Job responds, Zophar. And during the course of it, they're getting more and more harsh in their response. Well, how does Job talk about these things? Looking at chapter 23, verses 10 through 12, he still defends himself. Chapter 23, verses 10 through 12, God is going to find me innocent. I have not left his path. He's going to test me and find me to be true and like pure gold because I followed him. So Job is maintaining his innocence. Looking at chapter 27, verses 3 to 6. Job is saying, I can't accept this viewpoint that you guys are laying on me about the reason for my suffering. Even my wife has told me to deny God, right? And to give up my integrity. But even with his constant badgering by his friends, Job is confident that he's going to retain a clear conscience. He also uses some courtroom language. I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at that. Chapter 9, verses 2 to 3. He's not able to bring any kind of a legal defense against God. And then verses 33 to 35. He says there's no umpire between us. Excuse me. So there's no judge that can stand between the two of them. So the idea of debating his case in court seems kind of pointless because there's nobody there to be the arbitrator, if you will, of that situation. And then at going to chapter 16, verses 19 to 21. This is an interesting passage, and this one has come up as part of the questions. chapter 16, verses 19 to 21. Where am I here? That's one theory. Why am I not finding it? Did I transpose my verses? It's because I'm reading in the wrong spot. Verse 25. As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth.
All right, and now for the final group discussion, I want to really hone in.
Let's shut him up a minute. Because he's cutting into my time. So, verse 25 of chapter 19, that's an interesting verse. Is that really what it's talking about? I don't think so. What's really going on here is that Job knows that God, and only God, could vindicate his innocence. And that's what he's referring to here. Job would die, but God would live on as his defender. And that word redeemer there, it's related to the issue of a kinsman redeemer, which you might have seen in other places of the Old Testament, particularly, for example, in the book of Ruth. There's a kinsman redeemer in Ruth. Boaz is the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and her mother. So that's the concept that's being given here. It's basically a word that means one who provided protection or legal aid for a relative who did not have the ability to do so, the ability to defend themselves. So Job knew, and he knows, that in the end, God would stand like a witness for the defendant in a courtroom and testify that Job was innocent. So that's the point that he's making here. Look at chapter 23, verse 4 as well. More of this courtroom language. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. If Job could find him, he's going to present his case before God as part of this litigation process. Unfortunately, he can't find him. So, all right, let's jump to this last segment. I should mention, as we go through, you're going to see that there's a change in, as I mentioned, the points being made by the three friends get more harsh as they go along, particularly in number 3.
All right, and now for the final group discussion, I want to really hone in on cycle number 3. With speech cycle number 3 that starts in chapter 22 and goes through Job 27, there's a lot of differences between cycle 3 and what's happened before. And so I want us to understand what those differences are and to think through why that matters. How does that contribute to the message of the book of Job? And so first, what's different about the structure of the third cycle? There's verses again on your handout to look at the structure and compare that to the structure that you saw in cycle 1 and cycle 2. So there's a pattern that was set up. There's a same structure in cycle 2 from cycle 1. And so you're expecting the same structure in cycle 3. It even starts off the same, but there's differences. And what are those differences? What happens differently regarding the speakers and who is speaking and what order they speak in? I also then want us to start asking the question, why? Given the differences, what are some possible reasons that these differences exist? Why do you think an author would have this third cycle that's so drastically different than all of the others? So after you've brainstormed a lot of different ideas, or at least a couple, hopefully you can come up with 2 or 3 different ideas. What do you think is the most likely? What do you think the difference in the structure and the difference in the content communicates to us as readers? Why did the author make this third dialogue cycle so differently than the rest? Another way of thinking about this question, it's the same kind of question getting at the same idea, is why are there 3 cycles? What would happen differently to us as readers if there was just 1 cycle? What is it that having 3 cycles and having the same structure in cycle 1, the same structure in cycle 2, and a different structure in cycle 3, what happens to us as readers when we read it? Sometimes that can be a window into the purpose and function of the way the text is shaped. So I want us to consider this third dialogue cycle, recognize that there are some differences, understand what some of those key differences are, think of some possible reasons that those differences can exist, and then to kind of hone in on what we think is really going on in chapter 3, in the third dialogue cycle. And so the final question that to consider is, where are we at the end of Job 27? So at the end of the 3 dialogue cycles, where are we? What is the story? Where has the story started? Where has it come to? But also, where are you as a reader? When you are reading these 3 dialogue cycles, what would you be feeling at the end of Job 27 if you're reading it for the first time? What are the questions that are in your mind? What are the responses that you're having at the end of this third dialogue cycle? And how can that help inform our interpretation of what the purpose and function of these chapters are supposed to be? So those questions are going to be the focus for your final group discussion. Again, what's different about the structure of the third cycle? What are some reasons for these differences, and why does it matter? I hope that this class session, though it's been a little bit different, has been helpful as a way to encourage you to talk with each other and looking at the biblical text itself in order to come up with the answers to these questions as we've worked through the dialogue cycles. And so next week, when I get back, we will review the 3 dialogue cycles and continue moving forward as we look at chapters 28 through 31 together. So thank you so much. Special thank you to Chris for facilitating and leading the class this week when I could not be there. Thank you so much.
So take a look. What is different in the structure of the third cycle? It's pretty evident as you go through it. And also, what's weird about chapter 27, verse 1? So take a moment and look at that. And then be thinking about what are some possible reasons for the difference in the cycles. Why is this third cycle different from the other 2? Oh, somebody made a comment, DJ. Somebody's onto something. So what have you discovered as different about the third cycle? Zophar missing. So far, Zophar is missing, to Craig's point. So Zophar is missing here, right? He's not speaking now. And then what is strange about chapter 27, verse 1 versus chapter 26, verse 1? I heard it. What was it? Job keeps going. In the past, in the previous cycles, we've been seeing that, there's a stop, and then Job does his thing, and then he stops. But now he keeps going. So he is going to defend himself greatly. In chapter 25, basically, chapter 22, look at verse 5 of 22. Eliphaz and Bildad are trying harder than ever to really condemn Job, to prove that he's a great sinner. Look at the language they use in chapter 22, verse 5. Is not your wickedness great, and your iniquities without end? I mean, that's pretty harsh. You're just a bottomless pit of sin. That's all you are. So they're being pretty harsh here. But Job declares his innocence, his longing for God. In chapter 23, he goes through that process. And in chapter 25, Bildad has essentially run out of arguments. And now he's just getting to the point where he's just saying, you know what, Job, you're being very presumptuous in your thinking that you can argue with God. He doesn't really get into any depth in 25 at all. Chapter 25 is the shortest speech in the book. You can see that it's only, 6 verses? So Bildad has run out of things to talk about. But at the same time, starting in chapter 27, we now have the longest speech, which is Job's reply. He goes on 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. So he's really stretching this thing out. He's got the longest reply of all. And in chapter 27, verse 5, he's no longer talking or responding to an individual member of his friend group. He's talking to them as a whole. You can see the word you in there. Far be it from me that I should declare you right. That you in the manuscript is in the plural. So he's addressing all 3 of the friends. So we have this difference here. Zophar is not speaking. Job continues on, quite a tirade, if you want to call it that. And he's addressing all 3 of his friends rather than a particular individual. So now we really boil down to the question, what are some possible reasons for the difference? What does the difference communicate? Pastor Denny's still going, so we have a little time. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Oh, that's an interesting one. I hadn't thought of that. Either Zophar ran out of arguments or he's starting to agree with Job. Maybe. Why were there 3 cycles? Why 3 cycles? Okay. When we see 3 of anything in Scripture, what is that usually an indication of? There's an emphasis being placed on something, right? I think, now I'm getting out on a limb here. Pastor Cooper did not give me any reasons why there's 3 cycles, okay? Nor did he give me any reason why the 3rd one is different. So I'm going to speculate all over the place. And you can join me in my speculation, or you could say, go pound sand. And we're going to wait for Cooper to come back next week and answer the question. So I think that the reason why there's these 3 cycles is for emphasis, so that we really get the point. If there was only 1 cycle, it would be a lot harder for us to get the point, right, of what's going on here and what the arguments are, both from the friend side and from Job's side. But by having the 3 cycles, the writer of Job, and Job, we should realize, this is one of the most significant works of ancient poetry in existence. And we as Americans are way too pragmatic. We don't do poetry, right? At least a lot of us don't. Maybe Kayla does. But a lot of us don't do poetry. But poetry impacts us not only intellectually, but also emotionally too. So we get both, all elements of us are being impacted by the writing of Job, by the way the book is laid out. So my theory is, and again we'll wait till next week when he comes back and answers the question, I think there's 3 cycles just for the fact that God wanted to emphasize what's going on here. He wanted to emphasize the arguments of Job and the arguments of the 3 friends. Now, that brings up another question. Why is Zophar not included? Anybody have any ideas? Other than he ran out of things to say and is starting to agree with Job. I like that one, though. That's a good one. Maybe he died? Job has a track record of losing people around him, so that may be a consideration. Can I give you another theory? He gave up. That's another one. And I don't know why this theory popped into my head. Maybe it was divine inspiration. We don't know. My theory is, and you can tell me to go pound sand if you want to. My theory is that we are the third person. As the readers, the writer has purposely left Zophar out of there so that we can react to everything that's gone on so far as the reader. Something to think about. Something to think about. Because he asks the question, where are we at the end of chapter 27? And if you read through chapter 27, unfortunately we didn't have time to do that, but basically it's Job's defense. He's laying it all out. He's affirming his innocence. He goes through that process. He does what's called imprecating his enemies. You've heard of imprecatory psalms, which are ones that say, God, please kill my enemies. Okay? So he's imprecating his enemies, and he's talking about the wicked. In contrast to the wicked, here I am. So he's giving his own defense. But that's my theory. And you can take with it what you think. But I think, hey, maybe we are the third person here now. Because we need to react to, how are we going to react to what we've heard so far? From the friends and from Job.